Hey, Brandon,
Hey, Alan.
and welcome to Dice Over Everything, the miniatures gaming podcast.
Yeah, so you know how usually say like, "Oh, everything was better back in my day," but this time I'm like, I don't know if we're talking about like cool, like world building stuff, like the quality of TV shows. I think we're probably more spoiled now
Mhm.
because you think like for 3D animated TV shows we've been seeing lately, there's been like the Clone
Mhm.
Wars that's been going on, and then like the Bad Batch that came after that. And I think back to when
Mhm.
we were young, like, what was kind of the equivalent show back then? And I don't know what sort of 3D animated show comes to mind for you from like the 90s.
Reboot?
Yeah, exactly. We're on the same page here. And and I've
You
gone
you
back.
set me up. You're stringing me along like some
hmm
mastermind. Of course.
hmm
Go on.
And and it's like I've gone back and tried to watch clips of Reboot. It's like, ooh, this animation is not there. I cannot go back and
That's
watch
true.
this show no matter how much people wax lyrical about it. It's like, no, you can't go
Mhm.
back and do it again. You can
People
never relive
wax
that.
lyrical about reboot.
Yeah, they do in terms of animated shows, like that were groundbreaking from then.
Wow. Okay, it was groundbreaking,
hmm
but more for the fact that it was just 3D than
Yep.
actual story or anything.
Well, a lot of people like
So
the
I don't
second
know.
season story, but anyhow.
So here's the thing. I kind of I was totally on board when you said, "Oh, we're spoiled for choice now in
hmm
terms of like things being better now."
Yep.
Except then you said the Bad Batch and some other Star Wars junk that I think is garbage.
I
So
was.
then I was like, I think you've immediately defeated your hypothesis before it began. Because here's the thing,
So.
I agree, 3D was
hmm
terrible back then because the technology was not there yet,
Yep.
right? If you go and watch Toy Story
hmm
now, the animation is garbage. Even if you go back and watch something
I
like
know
10
that.
years after that, if you watch The Incredibles, which I loved when it came out, and I watched it as an adult, uh, the animation is garbage there too.
Yeah, that's
It's
what I'm
actually
saying. Like
really bad.
the animation now, even on like a side show like The Bad Batch, is still like pretty decent. So we're just
So
getting
here's the
spoiled now
thing.
for like.
You are barking up the wrong tree though,
hmm
because back then the equivalent was not 3D animation like Reboot
Yep.
or Beast Wars. It was 2D animation. And
Oh
if
yeah.
you are going to come and tell me that the modern, like, I don't know, let's say Disney classics
hmm
that are 3D are better than the ones we grew up with, which are Aladdin, that run, that 4 or 5 year run that
hmm
got killed by Pocahontas. So,
Okay.
like, Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King, uh, are the movies these days, like, are that they don't, although they're good, right? You have, what do you call it, Frozen, which is pretty good.
hmm
They're not as good as those.
Are you sure it's not just like the story that's behind it that's really what's compelling you to think that way?
It's both.
Be
It's both.
both. Okay.
Actually, probably one of my favorite movies was uh, Somewhere in Between,
hmm
which is like, back in the old days, but like if you were a 20-year-old or 25-year-old, you would say back in the old days, and then you would say the movie I'm about to say, Lilo and Stitch, which was like one of the last 2D movies that Disney made, is an amazing movie. And you go
Okay.
back and watch that, that was, I think, equivalent in terms of quality. And
Okay.
I'm not like there's the new stuff is pretty good, right? I did like Turning Red. That was pretty fun. Um, but I think they do not make them like they used to. And
Mm.
there is, in terms of story, this is like a topic for another day. I've literally been talking about this all the time with everyone I talk to about media. Like sequelitis is definitely a thing that's happening all over the larger mainstream. However,
Okay.
that is not true, and where I thought you were going to go is for um, indie stuff. Indie stuff, because of the internet, there's so much proliferation of really good stuff by small creators that is so much more accessible now than there was before. So that I would agree. So that's why I would actually still, in the end, agree with you. But don't tell me it's Disney Star Wars that makes everything great.
Well, I was about to say what is great is the Clone Wars, and it's very sad that you've not got on board with that. But well, we could get into that with some of the games we'll talk about in this podcast, I guess.
Sure. Oh yeah, we're not a movie and media podcast. We are a miniatures gaming podcast.
And this week we're talking about, I don't know, not the model quality and the visual aspect, but
yes, but the fluff. So the fluff is a very much miniatures, I guess historical word. Sorry, it's late. And we're going to talk about whether or not, or if fluff, which is the story in our miniature games, whether it's the secret sauce.
Okay. I think way back in the day, aka 2019, we did do a podcast
before the before times. That's true.
In the before times when we were stronger, faster, and apparently more entertaining. But no one's going to go back and watch that to know this.
Yeah. So when we did record these late at night.
Yes. When it wasn't by Zoom. Yeah, I know. When you had to go do things in a recording studio.
Yeah.
Anyhow. So I don't know if we started that off with much direction, but just thinking about the games that are out there, I was going through like...
Wait. When you say way back in 2019, sorry, I'm not following. Way back in 2019, what?
Oh, when we were stronger and faster and smarter.
Okay, sure.
That's all?
Okay, what about 2000? Oh, you're about to say something.
That's when the episode we did on Fluff.
Oh, we did an episode.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, we did an episode. Yeah, obviously. Yeah, I knew that. In 2019, we did an episode about Fluff originally.
And I don't know if I had a conclusion. Like, I know we went a whole bunch of directions with it in terms of like its value for the game, but like I don't think we really figured out how it fits in to whether you need to have it to keep like to get people into the game and keep them in the game. I know like it definitely, we talked about how it enhances the game big time, and especially we talked about how like it needs to reflect how the gameplay goes, otherwise you just have this weird incongruity and you don't understand what you're getting into, and it's just the stories, you just don't relate to them as well if they're not the same thing as you're playing on the table. So I think we talked a lot about that, but I think we more want to get into like whether the fluff is like necessary to get you into the game and keep you in it. Yeah,
like as a more of a almost like at a higher level, not on a personal level of the person who's playing, but on a game level, and the health overall of that game organism or that game industry, and the companies that create it, right?
Yeah.
Like what do they think? Like how important is it for them to keep these games alive and getting in fresh blood?
Yeah. So if you think of the really big games that are. I'd almost call them like, if you're thinking about the TV analogy where they have like seasons to them and they keep putting out like new progression of the storyline. The question is, well, do you need that A, to keep the people engaged with the story, or B, are they just using it as a mechanism cynically to just keep selling new stuff? Like, because obviously it serves the purpose of selling new stuff by putting out new fluff to get people like hyped, about new models or just introducing the new models. Because I'm trying to think of a game that progresses the story much to keep people in it without like simultaneously also like integrating the miniature releases. I know every time we go to Frostgrave, but that as well does sell like, well, the story's not really progressing. It's just you're going.
The world is getting fleshed out more. Actually, it's interesting with Frostgrave. I was just listening to another podcast. I would name the actual podcast, but I actually forget what it was. I listen to a
Okay.
lot of podcasts. And the people were talking about how I think one of the person I think it was the guest on the podcast was talking about how they really liked Games Workshop and the Games
Hmm.
Workshop world, right? The old world and all of this kind of stuff, because we all kind of grew up with this kind of stuff more or less, right? Um, and how he liked Frostgrave the game, but he felt like the Frostgrave the game did not have a world for him to jump into, and
Hmm.
that kind of dragged away from his ability to get into the game, right, and enjoy it. And to me that was like a little bit I guess there's a couple of things going in there. Like, first of all, um that was from what I understand from interviews that I've listened to from the creator Joe McCullough. The part of that was intentional, right?
Yep.
He made the initial Frostgrave book um, more open with a light framework, so that it could evoke. It was just enough to evoke a kind of world and setting, and then you can fill it in any way you want, right? So your creativity can run free, right? But then, second of all, if you have bought a lot of the expansions and books that came afterwards, that's
Yeah.
no longer even true. Frostgrave, the world, is quite well fleshed out now.
Yeah, I just don't necessarily think it has like a linear timeline going to it, like some games try to create. It has lots of areas to it and like history to
Yeah.
it, but I don't think it's trying to push like a linear timeline to itself.
Yeah, well, I guess the thing with Frostgrave, right? It's like wizards battling over treasure, but you're fighting over the ruins of something, right? So
Hmm.
when he reveals, like, when these campaign books reveal things, they reveal things that happened in the past, right?
So it's like
And you
reading into the
kind of
history.
at this point, yeah, like reading into the history and fighting a surprising number of wizards who have, like, evil wizards who have survived thousands of years as ghosts or shades or something that you have to put down once and for all.
Hmm.
Uh, so that's the thing. It's kind of interesting that um, initially, at least for Frostgrave, the hook is if you read the book, you're like, oh, there's not much there. But if you buy
Hmm.
the campaign books, there's a lot of history, right? We fought through a 12 campaign a 12
12
what do you
mission
call it?
campaign.
Mission campaign, fighting in the greatest university of the old city, right, of Frostgrave, where we fought a whole bunch of raids, and that revealed a lot about what the actual, like, how things worked back then, right? What this old city was like and who these people were. And then we also fought a lich, right, on
Hmm.
another one, right? So a more revealed. And then there's books about the underground, right, where there's like breeding pits of, like, just like what do you call it? Uh, gladiatorial combat underneath there's always being gladiatorial combat. It's kind of
Okay.
revealed both constructs and undead were used as labor, right?
Hmm.
So all of these things kind of reveal it's actually really fleshed out if you buy all the books that come out, right?
Hmm.
So if you're talking about a game that kind of continues to entice you to buy the next thing, or to learn more, and to stay in the game, right, above and beyond just the gameplay and things like that, which are great, right? It's my favorite gameplay. These little, like, every time you buy a book, you get a little more morsel of what the world is like, a little bit more of what it is, what is in the world, and you can go back and, like, put that into the miniatures and the terrain and the monsters that you paint on your next time you play, to continue to play in that city, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So to a more general note, like before this, I was reading up just about like to try and think about like a breadth of games, reading up on
Mm-hmm.
like skirmish games that people like because I didn't
Mm-hmm.
really want to look at the mass battle games. And most
Yeah, we can talk
people,
about them later.
yeah, most people sort of focus like the first thing they brought up was like the setting. Is it sci-fi? Is it cyberpunk? Is it all that? Just how people were trying to like do a good job describing what the game is. So that seemed to be their first
Mm-hmm.
go-to for that. And then after that, well, obviously, I was only looking up skirmish, so no, they didn't need to bother saying that. Then beyond that, they started just thinking about the rules. So most people seem to be ignoring a little bit of the story element, but then again, all the games they were talking about all had strong like story elements to them. Nobody even bothered like much to talk about games that lacked that element. So it seems like the games don't even get onto people's radar without it.
I feel like, yeah. So I guess what games were you talking about? Like for certain things, when you talk about certain ones, a lot of them, a lot of the biggest one come prepackaged with like IP, right, and stories that everyone already knows. So you just by the name of it, you don't really have to tell much more besides the general kind of thing, right? But you're talking about sci-fi, so if you have to define the actual setting, then what are these games that you are talking about where the fluff doesn't come into it? Because from my feeling and from my looking, the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because I've been, we're creating a game, right? We've created a game and we're kind of shaping the story. Well, we've done a lot of the rules and a lot of the playtesting and stuff like that, and we're trying to and we did some like groundwork for the world and art, but we're trying to define that, get that dialed in, right? And so when I look at other people, when they're looking at games, they often like it's not a lot of sentences, but it's often more than just, oh, this is a sci-fi game, right? A sci-fi game with a certain number. But then like when you hear people get really excited and trying to sell things, they talk about almost always it's not about mechanics. It's about the setting and the world that hooks you. And then you talk about, and then there's some mechanics that are cool.
So after that, I went and searched more for like miniature agnostic skirmish games that people like, because I'm like, well, if you take the
so what games were we talking about first of all?
Well, basically, I searched for that because if you take the miniatures out of the aspect and those big properties that have all this art, and you end up in the miniature agnostic space, now like people's impression of the game is not being so influenced by like the miniatures and that, and now it's just like entirely like what's written as the fluff is the impression people get. And nobody really seemed to care about the games where it's just like, oh, it's this open-ended whatever rule system. Like people were talking about them, but they were very like infrequently taken up. I'm just thinking of almost like Stargrave, where the setting is very like do whatever you want, and people didn't seem to latch on to it nearly as much.
People latched on to Stargrave
really
pretty decently. I don't know what you're talking. Like you got to name the game. So you're saying Stargrave people didn't latch onto. I know you didn't latch onto it for sure. But when I look at in general, first of all, like Stargrave obviously has done pretty well for Osprey because they printed off a lot of books. I heard an interview, I think, with Joe McCullough that Stargrave is doing pretty well. Yeah, and it's actually relative to even to Frostgrave, like just the setting and everything like that makes it. It's probably honestly the proximity to Warhammer 40,000 that has really helped it, right? But it seems like it's still doing quite well. And you look at the other games, so I think that's actually more of like a hit as opposed to like a miss. I know that you don't like it, but a lot of people use it, and a lot of people used it to like put on, even though the world is more of a, what do you call it? What's that TV show from like 10 years ago? Firefly. It's very much a Firefly-esque world, right? And so like but I guess Warhammer 40K fans will just kind of like paste on the Warhammer 40K-esque kind of things onto it, right? And people play it for that, right? But when you're looking at a lot of other games, like there's definitely games that, like if you're talking about an entirely miniature agnostic games, like obviously if you're talking about Song of Blades and Heroes, it is intentionally super generic, right? And it's quite popular, right? Relatively speaking. But I think there's just not enough room for like very, very generic uh games because people want things that are tailored directly to the miniatures that they want, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
that they're in their collection that they want to use, right? So when people think, oh, I want a Western, like I have a bunch of cowboys, I'm not going to use like generic shooting game, right? That can
Mm-hmm.
also be used for cowboys or modern or science fiction, right? They're going to look for the thing that actually screams or breathes and exudes the cowboy aesthetic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like from what I've seen, right? Like, and obviously, like the biggest ones are ones with IPs, right? Like Atomic Mass Games has a whole bunch of really strong IPs. It has Star Wars and Marvel, right? And it blew up basically out of nowhere, right?
Yep.
Because when people look at that game, I don't even know if anyone really talks about when
The
they try to
rules.
sell those games, the rules. They talk about, hey, it's Marvel, it's Star Wars. You want to play Star Wars and play Marvel? Yeah, you play these
Mm-hmm.
games, right? And then afterwards, when people are like me, I'm not a big Star Wars fan anymore. Um, then they have to be like, no, no, but it's a good game, and let me tell you why all of these different things. And to be fair, like Star Wars Legion, I have played it. There's a lot of really good things in Star Wars Legion, and I can say that I think my feelings after I played it were, oh, this is a pretty good game. Too bad it's Star Wars because
Yep.
I didn't feel like the gameplay matched Star Wars at all, and also I'm not that into Star Wars.
Okay.
Side note, I almost got into Legion because they released Ewoks,
Mm-hmm.
but apparently you cannot play an all Ewok army, so I was like, forget it. It's
Well,
stupid.
I don't know. My impression of
Play
it seemed to be that
Rebels? Lame.
my impression was there was like tailoring to more the Clone Wars era, which I think is cool. But given that you don't seem to have jumped on the Clone
Shatterpoint.
Wars,
Yeah, Shatterpoint.
yep. No,
Talking about
Shatterpoint's
Shatterpoint,
100%.
not Legion.
Really, I
I've never
thought.
played Shatterpoint.
Mhm.
Legion was released with the original.
Yep.
They released the trip the what do you call it?
Clone Wars eras.
The yeah the pre what do you call it? The first three.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I ignored their existence and called the Clone Wars era. Those three movies can be
sure. So
replaced with
yeah,
a
yeah.
TV
The
show.
first three they released the first three after, but the
Mm-hmm.
first set was actually Empire versus Rebels.
Yeah. Maybe it's just the miniatures got better when they started releasing those. So I'm like, oh, now it's
That's
cool.
true. That's true. The first miniatures were terrible.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I guess the fluff there basically draws people in 100%. There's so many other games. Well, so do you think people go in to find a miniature game where they have like a setting in mind that they want to
Yeah,
play in? Yep.
that's why they
Okay.
say setting first. I
That's
think.
that's probably like why I was looking it up. Everybody says setting first. Like, so you're looking for sci-fi, or are you looking for high fantasy?
You
Like,
look for historicals,
mm-hmm.
ancients, right? Modern.
Yeah,
I don't know who wants to play modern these days, but
exactly. But it's easy. Like everybody understands it.
I'm okay with fantasy
Mm-hmm.
modern, but like real modern, that to me is just crazy.
Yeah. So I guess the next thing, once you've established like that really big, wide area of the setting, is it like
Mhm.
you've got to tell the player what's happening in that setting? Like, are they like is it all out war? Are they like trying to gather some sort of resource, like we're talking about in Frostgrave, grab all the treasure?
Post-apocalyptic.
Are you like going out monster hunting, like in that?
Yeah, just trying to survive or whatever. Yeah, is it a
Like,
campaign like thing? Are you going to follow your characters and see what they're doing, or is every single time you have a fight where it's like a all-out Avengers Assemble battle?
yeah, because like that purpose can happen with in any of those like overall settings. But oddly, I don't feel like people were telling me that when they were talking about like the games they were into. But it does seem like a really important part of the game you're getting into. Like,
Yeah.
oh, in terms of
So
like how
that
I think it's more of how like
yeah.
interacts with the rules. Though once you get down to that level, like is that part congruent with the rules? Is something that
Yeah,
matters.
I think that's the thing, that the fluff is not like the story, the setting, and all these things is
Mm-hmm.
not divorced from everything else, right? That we love. But I feel like when you go into a game, when you're talking about it, when I hear people talk about, how they love this game, they talk about it in a story way. Like we are, story, like we think in stories, right? People think in stories. And so when people talk about, even when they talk about the games they played, right? You're like, oh, I played this really awesome game, like for Infinity, let's say, right? Oh, I talk about how, my Namor just basically shrugged off all wounds, right? And then like shot them, like ran up a wall and shot the guy in the face, right? Like that's how you talk about it, as opposed to then I move 6-2 and then total immunity stop the actual wound from going through. Some people do that, but that's a lot more boring. And I feel like
I rolled this and then it
you're
causes
not
this
winning
effect.
people when you say that kind of things, right? But when you hear people talk about stories, like they turn the games into stories, they are able to really sell it. And when I'm seeing people talk about new games, their eyes light up when you talk about the games in a story way. Like when we go for drinks afterwards and people are talking about the latest game they played, right? If they're just talking about, there's certain people like us, maybe we're more engineering mind and stuff like that, right? Where we will break things down and we're like, oh, this part is cool, this part, right? These three mechanics and shit like that, right? But when you see a lot of people, the best way to sell them from what I see is they tell them the story that the game is trying to play, and then they tell them about the mechanics that reinforce that story. You know what I mean? Like if you're playing, X-wing, it's dogfighting, right? You're like deking in and out, right? Your ship is outmaneuvering the other person, and they say, oh, and it's reinforced by this cool mechanic. Because again, we are playing games, right? But to me, that's the way they talk about even mechanics. Is it's not just about this is a cool thing. It's sometimes they do, right? We talk all the time about how Infinity, it has the cool like bluffing stuff, right? That is in not a lot of games, but like even in Infinity, when I talk about it, I talk about how when I think about the coolest part of Infinity, it's the Ramboing that you can do, right? Yeah. Even though mechanically speaking and in gameplay wise, it's like a push and pull and a resource management, right? And there's a lot of ability to push your luck basically go for broke, right? There's always ability to go more for broke the worse things go, right? So if things are going bad, that's the kind of mechanical idea. But when I talk about it to other people, I'm talking about the ability to go and Rambo and have a guy like burst through the lines and go crazy,
do something heroic. Yeah
exactly, right? So you kind of make it, even though the thing that makes Infinity unique is the way that the gameplay informs the story, right? The way that you talk about it and the way you think about it is that fluff kind of idea, right?
Yeah, like if you're not playing a super competitive game like miniatures or whatever else, I feel like it's kind of like leans almost into the D&D sort of thing where you're basically playing like a collaborative story. Because it's not just like a video game where you do like you press a button, things happen. It's like there is a back and forth to it for how things are working on the board and like an agreement to how the game is playing. And that just for that to work, you have to like be in the same story space. And the way that gets created is just like, okay, the game has given you background story. Like, what are you supposed to be doing there? What's like beyond just the world? Like, what is everybody doing there? So you can establish like you have that. It basically creates a language for you to have that back and forth dialogue about what the story is on the board. Because if you're
to bring everything to life,
which is why maybe I don't like Stargrave, because I feel like Stargrave allows some person to be like, oh, I'm playing Space Marines and we're going on like a Xenos hunting mission, but then the other player is like, oh, I'm playing a bunch of Jedi and we're going out with our lightsabers to be Jedi. It's like, but how do you share your story? This is what I think that's one of the reasons why I don't like it. Even though they can all exist in one world, I just feel like it's
sure. I think the thing is, although there's abilities that can kind of go one way or the other, you really you can't be a Space Marine, and you can't be a Space Marine squad because first of all, you only have two guys. You have your captain and your first mate.
Yeah,
and
the
the
guys
rest
are
of
more
your guys
generic.
are chums, which
Yeah.
could be guardsmen. You
Mhm.
can say you have your captain and first mate, but even the way you're playing is you're running around capturing data, and your captain and first mate are not tough enough, and they still have that, even though they're in some ways they're tougher or more survivable, let's say, than wizards, right? They can also have armor. They It's because they dodge in and out of cover. So you cannot actually be a space marine.
No.
You can be more of a Jedi, but you're not like, you can't be Obi-Wan, right? You can be a guy with a laser sword, right? But it's almost, and the reason why I think the Jedi thing works better is, again, because it's a space western.
Yep.
And Jedi are a mix of space western and samurai, right? Which is technically, westerns traditionally in the movie sense were informed by samurai films, right? So I guess technically everything's a samurai film, right? but so that's why I think you can actually be more of a Jedi than you can be you just can't be a space marine. And so I think maybe it didn't necessarily for you do a good enough job of telling you who you can actually be, right? Like, you could be an inquisitor, right? Because you have to be human.
Yeah.
And or you could be a lizard man, technically, right? Like a lizard alien. But you still have to be like in that kind of realm, right? The more like old school, pulpy science fiction kind of world where you have a bunch of abilities. You cannot be like a super uber powered space marine running around shooting everyone in the face, right? You're the kind of guy where you're ducking in and out, and you take a couple of shots with your gun and then you have to duck back into cover, kind of thing. That's more of how the world works, right? And so to me, I see more, and maybe that's why I like Stargrave more, is I feel like there's a lot more story in it, right? I see a lot more hooks in it, right? Like the fluff for Stargrave is that it's basically there was a galactic civil war, and the two sides lost, basically, right? And so not they didn't lose, but like basically in the war, the two big empires, I don't know if there's only two, but they're like the empires that were fighting, they basically collapsed. They all collapsed, and now everything is taken over by warlords, right? So everything, you're in more like of a warlord period where in the rubble of this empire, of the old empires, there's just a million and one small little fiefdoms with pirates and things like that running around and controlling everything. And so that is actually a pretty, in my opinion, that's a pretty good setting, right? That's an interesting setting that you can do a lot with.
So maybe it's just hard to communicate that setting in a couple words. Like certain things, it's just like, here's your orcs versus goblins fantasy.
Did you read? See, here's the thing. I bought the book though, so I did read the fluff section, right?
No, I want the impression before I buy anything.
Now you're making me want to see what the back of the book is. All right.
That's even too much reading. It's got to be the people's impression, not what they're trying to
People's
sell.
impression is it's doing pretty good. So so science fiction war games in the ravaged galaxy. So already it's talking about fluff, right? In a galaxy torn apart by the last war, vast pirate fleets roam from system to system, robbing, extorting, and rounding up slaves. Any attempt to form any kind of central authority larger than a city-state is quickly and brutally crushed. In this dark time, the only way to survive is to stay small and inconspicuous. Amidst this chaos, however, thousands of independent crews manage to carry on their business. Smugglers, relic hunters, freedom fighters, and mercenaries roam the dead stars in small ships, scratching out a living any way they can. I think that's pretty thematic. The entire thing has nothing about the gameplay. It's all about the theme.
It's all about the setting.
Yeah. And my assumption is this is the first time you've ever heard about the theme of Stargrave.
Yeah, no, I've never read that part. Just see pictures of miniatures that people are using for, and it's like, these things don't fit together.
No, that's fair, right? I guess this is one of those things that you're talking about, like in in a miniatures kind of agnostic game. Now the thing with Stargrave is technically they have their own miniatures, right? And it's much more pulpy science fiction, and the aliens are like more like guy in, you know, with in a mask kind of costumes, right? Those are the kind of aliens. So that's the kind of thing that the actual miniatures for Stargrave they're trying to sell, right? However, you're right in that, you know, because Stargrave is in, you know, a science fiction world, and in a world where, you know, a lot of people want to move away from, if they're moving away from, let's say, playing in the 40K world proper, the most miniatures everyone's going to have, right? 40K is by far the biggest miniatures game in the world. People are going to have 40K miniatures. So you're just going to see a lot of Warhammer 40,000 miniatures, and unfortunately, Space Marines, right? Even though Space Marines, you can't even start off being a Space Marine. Now, there is like a power suit that you can use, which I guess would be a Space Marine thing, but it literally costs money for your character to use it every single time you use it. It's called Armored Trooper. And
I read that
they
part.
still die. I'm pretty sure they still die because there's crits, right? If you play with crits, and you're supposed to play with crits, an Armored Trooper still dies to a crit in this game.
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of like if you have +2 shoot, you roll 20, you add 5 damage, it's 27. They have 13 armor, 14 health. They still die to a random guy shooting them in the face, like with a crit. So they're not very Space Marine-ish, even the super armored guys. But yeah, so I don't know.
Yeah, so it seems difficult without miniatures to really get the theme across quite as well, unless I guess you have to like trying to think how you like, because a lot of the games, miniature agnostic ones, sort of like have done Kickstarter ones that have got things more like in the direction they're thinking of. So maybe that's
so you're
one
talking
way to
about
achieve it.
Well, when I look at, so I guess my postulation is that the fluff and the story, right, is the thing that hooks people. And I'll tell you a bunch of games that reinforce this. I don't actually necessarily think Stargrave is one of those. I think Frostgrave was. I think it was a very, very simple story, but it hooked people because it was imaginative enough, right? And at the time, it was pretty unique in the world, right? It's a wizard-centric story, and there were not really wizard-centric games out, right? So a wizard-centric story in a frozen city. Now, obviously, frozen settings are very, very popular in fantasy, but surprisingly, there's not ones that are so heavily invested in that way. Plus, with the magical wizards, right? It's like this fluff and this setting that kind of hooks you immediately, even before you really know a lot of details about what the actual city is. And then, as it gets fleshed out with the great campaigns and scenarios in the game, it kind of drags you along, right? So Frostgrave, I think, is one. I think if you look at other games, the games from Starling Badger Studios, when there's the Rain in Hell, right?
Yeah,
when
they're very
about that.
They talk about theme a lot, and they don't talk about the mechanics up front.
Theme is
much.
Number one. Yeah, and then afterwards, they're like, okay, so the theme is, they don't just say, oh, it's a fantasy game, right? It's a fantasy game where you're demons slashing each other in the face in hell. Right? So that is the theme that they're really hooking someone, and that word, that kind of sentence is really what hooks people first, right? Even if there's like later on you hear about, oh, they have a cool like initiative mechanic, right? And things like that, right? That stuff works afterwards, but it's just that theme, and then selling and the trust that people have that your games and your game's rules will sell that theme, right? Is the thing that hooks people. It's basically like that one line is the thing that makes, piques people's interests, right? You need that fluff, right? That interesting world or the interesting setting, right?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. I was trying to find games where those two weren't congruent. Like, obviously, if someone's going to make a good game, they're going to try and make those two things.
I don't want to talk
match
about
up.
games and then bash the mechanics, but let me just say, of all the games I mentioned, not all of them are good.
Oh, I know, but they can just the mechanics could match. They could just have bad mechanics,
Yeah.
and they could still match. Like,
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, I guess I did say, what was it? Oh, a Star Wars Legion. Star Wars Legion, obviously, it's Star Wars, so it immediately hooks people, right? I felt like it did not match. I don't think that the rules match the actual gameplay. I actually like the gameplay, but I don't think they are very Star Wars like. Whereas from what I hear, Shatterpoint, which I haven't played, the setting, right, the fluff is obviously very strong because it's the Clone Wars, which you said, at the very, very beginning of this podcast, is really good, way better than Reboot, which I don't know, that's damning with faint praise. But a lot of people, especially younger people, a lot younger than us, who grew up on that kind of stuff, they really like that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, so they would just possibly buy into the game based on that.
Yeah, actually, I listened to a podcast where they were talking about Shatterpoint, and basically the guy was saying, "Oh yeah, these are all the great things about Shatterpoint, right? All these great rules." Actually, he mentioned a lot of things that were not good about it first, but then he went through a laundry list of things that he loved, and then the very end, the other co-host who hadn't played it and asked him, "Okay, so if this was not Star Wars, would you play it?" And he said no.
Yeah.
Even though he was talking about how good it was, like almost all of that stuff, like he wouldn't play it, even though he was talking about how great it was, he wouldn't play it if the story didn't line up with one of his favorite settings.
Right?
If the setting wasn't right for what he wanted.
Yeah, well, just like I won't bother playing any like modern warfare, World War II stuff. I'm like, I have no interest in this aesthetic. You can't get the person at all. But the thing is, like, if we're talking about story, like
you have no desire yet. We'll see. We'll see if I can win you over with World War II. Modern is harder, I think. Oh, actually, you know what I was thinking? How about this? What happens if I came to you and I said, okay, there's this amazing game called Furious and Fast, and basically it's Fast and Furious, but the miniatures game, where you have cars and you smash the cars, you jump out, you punch people, you jump back into cars, and you keep on going. The cars are always going at the same time. Would you consider it?
It's like Gaslands, but you can actually jump out with like little dudes and start beating on each other.
And you jump onto the car and you fight onto the car, and you're always on highways, right? And if you fall off, you have to catch a ride on another car before, or if you get left behind, right? Because everything is always moving. Then you kind of come back by surfing on another car that comes from behind and goes. Would you be interested?
The setting is getting me, but the story is even better. Like, that's the thing. The story is like another layer.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think because what we're talking about now is I think that the very upper level of like where it's set matters the most.
That's a game, by the way. We should think about that.
It is.
That'd be cool.
But then I don't know. Does the story within that even really matter? Because I guess we said the story matters because it helps the language of the back and forth. Yeah. But I don't know if the story like getting people into it. They're just like, oh, this like basic surface level thing. It's like, oh, here's Star Wars. What are you doing within the universe? Whatever. It's Star Wars. I'm in. Same thing with like Gaslands or the Fast and Furious game. It's just like, this is going to look cool on the board. I'm in. But then like the story part, I don't know if it, like how much. It doesn't sound like all these people are right about it.
I guess it's true. Like when I think about Fluff though, and I think about that thing, I guess to me, for sure I feel like when I see these kind of things and when people get into these games, right, the setting really matters, right? The setting, the thing though, it's like lining up an idea of like sparking imagination, right? Sparking imagination and wonder in your head where you're like, oh, what could it be? What could it actually look like in the world, right? that's kind of what you need to spark to get people hooked, right?
Yep. Or into it.
And
Mm-hmm.
and I guess you're right that in terms of when people talk about technically fluff, right? A specific story, right? A specific actually like instead of saying you are doing like we said, you're Fast and Furious, you're jumping from car to car and you're shooting things like that. That
Mm-hmm.
could be enough to evoke in people's minds something cool,
Yep.
as opposed to you are specifically Dominic Toretto fighting, doing that, like whether that or not, like
Trying to
that
compete with The
is cool
Rock
or
over
you're
who has the most coolest cars
yes.
and can do the coolest tricks on the road. Yeah.
Exactly, trying to get the heist, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
Fast and Furious and stuff like that, steal the thing. Is that whether or not that is I don't know what you call it. Is that whether or not that's
Essential to get people in the door.
essential? Yeah, like do you need that second level? I guess the thing is when you already have the setting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially we're talking about indie games, right? Like, or you're trying to sell someone in a game that doesn't actually have a property or an IP, right?
Yep.
Just when you say someone is jumping, like when I said fast, like furious and fast, like when I said the car jumping kind of like
Mm-hmm.
chase kind of genre thing, I said it's like Fast and the Furious, right? Although the game is not technically would not technically be Fast and Furious, I'm still selling you a theme and a fluff. It's just instead of coming in and bring you new fluff and new story,
Mm-hmm.
I'm inserting this property that everyone knows really, really well, that people enjoy,
Mm-hmm.
and inserting it in your head and saying, yeah, that, but the miniatures game, right? So
Yep.
you still have fluff. You still have that story. Like if you've never watched a Fast and Furious movie and I use that like terminology on you, would it make sense? Like I'd have to describe it a lot more, right? Like if
Yeah.
I didn't have that, I'd have to like you'd be saying, okay, so why are these guys jumping and fighting
Mm-hmm.
from car to car, right? Fighting on top of cars and doing this kind of stuff. It doesn't make sense except for in the context of knowing
Mm-hmm.
this stories that you have seen, right?
Yep.
Even if the game has shaved off the actual filed off the labels and stuff like that, you are still evoking those kind of fluff, that kind of story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's like Dominic Toretto, right?
Mm-hmm. So like, yeah. So I guess like GW basically created the stories themselves, whereas these other ones,
But did
like,
they?
no,
Did they
but
create the stories themselves?
I
They
don't.
did not actually. Like originally these stories were an amalgam. Like nowadays they have, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
fleshed out. But
Yeah.
from the origin, they were Dominic Toretto. They were Judge Dredd, right? Judge
Mm-hmm.
Dredd 2000 AD is the source of so much of Warhammer 40,000,
Yeah, that's how they
right?
got their start. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then the Chaos Gods were imported from fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
which was imported from I forget some fantasy novel that people read, right? Some other people read. Obviously,
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings, like
Mm-hmm.
orcs, is literally and elves.
And
They
it's just
literally took the
it's
miniatures they
fantasy,
had.
high fantasy in space. Mm-hmm.
Yes, they took the high fantasy and put it in space, right? And
Mm-hmm.
even Space Marines were not as big of a deal, but then as they like as things went on, right? Like, do you have you ever read that fluff blurb where there's a half elf space marine?
This offends me. I hope this does not exist.
It
The
doesn't
real
well, it
in.
existed in the past. I think the librarian of one of the chapters, hopefully it's the Ultramarines because they're lame, was a
Mm-hmm.
half elf or half Eldar space marine. Uh, yeah, and that's what the story was back then, right?
Doesn't fit the
And
fluff. It's supposed to purge the Xenos.
I know. Like honestly, it's become a lot more interesting and better as they've created their fluff and they've
Mm-hmm.
refined it, and they've kind of put it into like a tumbler, and all of the edges and all of the things that were other things have kind of been amalgamated or shaved off, and through iteration have turned into something fresh and new, right?
Mm-hmm. But only
So
once they
even
became huge could they, and like a long running property, could they do that, which sort of differentiates them from other ones.
hmm
But yeah,
but here's the
it's.
thing, like when you think about Games Workshop, right? Like we can be like, oh, so there's other games that do smaller things, like, and I've only mentioned a handful, right? Like I could go through a huge list, but instead I want to focus on the fact that Games Workshop is the biggest, right? And I think we've mentioned many times now in the past little while that, at least I think, and I think you agree, that the biggest the biggest like thing that Games Workshop or Warhammer 40,000 has going for them is the IP.
Mm-hmm.
It's the story, it's the world, it's the setting that kind of evokes emotion and ideas and puts in, when you think about having the miniatures on the table and what they're going to do, it's perfectly tailored pulp science fiction for a war game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I wouldn't necessarily want to read books about Warhammer 40,000, although a lot of people do, because it's pretty shallow, honestly. But it's, in terms of like, it's very deep in terms of history, very shallow in terms of like ethics and examining the human condition, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in a lot of things that you want from fiction, it's actually kind of shallow, right?
Yeah.
But it's great for a war game where you need enough, and you need something to make it like the war cool. You don't want to be, rolling your dice and having your war machines fighting the other guy while thinking, should we even be at war? What is life, is everything worth saving, right? Is it worth winning the battle when this is what we're fighting over, kind of thing? Which is why, like, I feel when people talk about Warhammer 40,000 and the stories that are the most engaging for a lot of people, it's the one with
massive battles.
No, it's the Inquisitor, like the books. I meant the fiction, not the. You're right. It's the massive battles for the fluff you want for when you think about playing. But when people read the fiction, I guess there is the Horus Heresy, which Games Workshop is trying to sell as like their equivalent of the Lord of the Rings, more like their equivalent of Harry Potter. But it's the story about the Inquisitor, right? I forget his name. The Inquisitor is Kane or something like that, where he's just a guy, right? And he's just trying to survive. So he, in the brutal, sadistic world of Warhammer 40,000. And that becomes interesting. But that is not interesting to throw that guy onto, like, a tabletop, because, like, it's interesting because he's the one sane person in a mad world, right? So what happens if both of you guys are the one sane person when you show up with your little war bands, right? Doesn't quite work. But great. But to me, this is like the best story, but the overall world, I don't know.
So it sounds like the overarching theme has to be there to get someone in the door. But then once they're in the door, just having that deeper layer of like stories and that for people to just invest their energy into might be what like really gets them to stay in it. Just like the people who get into 40K and then never seem to be able to get out. Like they've read all the stories, they've invested so heavily into all like the background that's in the codexes, and like with Infinity going on for longer and longer. Like this, people who've read the books from way back about like the origin stories of all that, and they get more and more invested in it. And same thing, like for Osgrave, once you've played through more and more campaigns, getting more and more of the stories that are back there, the more invested you get in it. But like in terms of getting in the door,
you want to play more in the world. It's like returning when you're playing. You put your miniatures on your table. Not everyone plays every single day, right? So or multiple times a week. So whenever you're coming back, and like for Frostgrove, we play it like maybe once a month or so. It's every time you play it, it's like you're coming back to something that you love, right? Something cool and interesting. And plus, we have not close to played all the missions in Frostgrave, so
if you only play once,
so it's like
once a month,
endless diving. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he can keep up.
Exactly. That's why we've got to play more. We've got to play more. But yeah, so I think that's true, right? Like you definitely need the surface level to the hook, right, of the world, and then
I think the
more story helps. Like slow. It's like when you play. Also, I don't know, when you play video games. Have you ever I don't know if you play video games anymore. I guess you don't, right? So now I'm also kind of old and not as into video games as I used to, and I played a lot of games, and I kind of am used to a lot of gameplay, so not a lot surprises me or really hooks me. And if it hooks me, I have no desire to become really good at video games. So once it stops being novel and like sparking joy in my head, I start getting really, really bored, right? Because I'm like, oh, I got to do the same thing over and over again.
I have to
And
reload my
I'm not,
save
I'm
and
not
try this fight again.
exactly. Oh, and I'm getting a little bit better. Oh, wow, great, right? But oftentimes for single player games, right, where they're like, oh, you got to get better to be able to beat this boss, right? I'm just like, the only reason I'm playing this is I want a little bit more story. I want to get to the ending and see the story and the world, right? So even though the idea of the game is cool, and even though oftentimes the gameplay is what keeps me in at first, right? So it's like the setting and everything in the world is cool. That's the first thing that it has to happen, right? Once that has happened, actually the gameplay has to be fun to keep you in it, right? Like moment to moment when you're playing it. After that, oftentimes the thing that keeps you in for the even longer run is loving the world, the setting, being there in the thing, right? And for a lot of games, this ends up being, for video games, for me now, it's just like sometimes I fall out of love of the gameplay and I'm only playing, or I just get tired of it, right? I'm only playing for feeling that being in that world and trying to get to the conclusion, trying to get those story bits, right? That fluff that they're drip feeding you.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe it comes like it's the third thing, but it's needed for the game to be like a really special game. It has to have that extra layer.
Well, I feel like especially for like miniature games, you kind of go through the same kind of thing, right? Oftentimes, if you like the surface level, you'll kind of
you'll pick up the minis because you like the aesthetic. You'll paint them.
You paint them up. You play the game. It's fun, and then after one or two games, you're like, well, I played it. I got my love of it. On to the next thing, right? When you have that world and you want to explore that world and you want to be in that world for longer, I think that's what gets you to, stick it out. Besides, of course, like sometimes you just play a game that has really cool gameplay that, you're constantly coming back just to explore. And it's not sometimes, a lot of the times, like that's part of it. But when you have a cool story and a cool world and you want to continue to visit that really can sink its teeth into you. And especially with campaign games, like that is why I think there's a new thing where campaigns are getting really popular. I think not just from the influence from D&D and things like that, but it really emphasizes story, right? And you need the world to have enough, like in D&D, right, in RPGs, you need the world to have enough setting that when you start playing with your friends, you can use those as like scaffolding to lay on the story that you and your friends are telling in your campaign, right?
Yeah, or just during that individual game.
Yeah, exactly. So there's like enough scaffolding that you understand it. You can place your game that you're playing into the world that you're returning to, right? As opposed to everything just being, in its own little bubble, right? It kind of ends up building on all the other games you've played.
Yeah. So in our last podcast, I dropped the hint that I was beginning a Drew's army for Akari, and you're like, "What? You didn't tell me that." But in reality, I wasn't building a Drew's army. I was building an Akari army, and actually painting them to the studio scheme as best as I could, because like unlike all the other factions that seem sort of like big and overarching, this is one like mercenary company. I'm like, damn, the story behind these people like branching off from the Japanese just because they're like the angry mercenary branch seemed very cool, just because the guy running it was a slighted general. It's like, oh, okay, there's actually cool fluff behind this rather than just being overarching. I'm like, I want this army, and because the figures looked cool too. But that combination was like, no, I'll actually paint an army in the real color scheme because like the background was cool enough for them.
So Akari is I actually haven't read the fluff for it, even though I have the books. Actually, I might have given the books to one of our friends. That's actually kind of interesting. That better than the traitorous, what is it, JSA, ruining the close combat ability of my Yujing.
Yeah.
And making me unable to play with one of my favorite models, the Raiden. Got a cool name too.
Whatever. It was
Oh,
good
you didn't care. You didn't play it.
I didn't care. I was post that
They
era.
betrayed me.
Mhm.
You
It was
know what?
post-
That's one of the things where the fluff like is echoed in the gameplay.
Mhm.
It's like as a Yujing player, when Japan was it was for fluff actually, right? When it was parceled off and turned into its own mercenary like company, right? So its own kind of mini faction,
Mhm.
I felt personally slighted. I'm like,
Mhm.
how could this happen? All of these models. I didn't paint that many. I didn't have that many Japanese models. I had like 4, but I was going to buy Shikami. So I was going to have like 4 or 5. But just those. Like I didn't even have that many models I lost, but I still felt slighted and
Mhm.
pained. And at the time I was very annoyed. Like it was fine because I had other armies, and technically Eugene's not even my main army, so
Mhm.
but yeah, it's interesting, how that kind of, in hindsight, looking back now, where they've kind of filled in the martial arts ability of
Yeah.
Eugene and cool units that I really like, right? They're just actually releasing it. They're filling it in finally at like, was it 3 or 4 years later or something, 5 years later, they're
Mhm.
finally filling in that hole that was left.
Yeah.
I
Should
don't
have
know
been filled.
I don't know how they're just filling it up with Korean troops. It's like,
Mhm.
oh,
They can redo it again. Yeah, but honestly, if you're that invested in the story, you're like, oh, okay, they destroyed some miniatures, but at least like they gave a story reason for it, and I care enough about the story
yeah,
moving on and the game
I
progressing
actually
and
do
having the story
appreciate
progress.
that.
I'm like, yeah, I'm okay with this. But people who are just like playing the game as competitive players who are like, oh, but the rating was so good, you took away my good piece. I'm like, you deserve that. You're not moving ahead with the story
How
because you
about
don't
me,
care as
where I
much the
like,
game.
how about me who was like, oh, the Raiden looked so cool. You took away my cool looking model.
They replaced it with some other cool looking models that do a similar role and have a similar name
And it
called
took so
Ryukin.
long. Like now I
Oh well.
agree, but it took like years for them to replace the cool looking models that they took
Yeah.
from me.
Just gotta trust their plan.
And in the meantime, they made a whole bunch of new JSA models, though even cooler models at the time when it happened. All
Mm-hmm.
of them were made for the faction could not play with my other models. I was like,
Yeah.
what the heck is this?
I'm
It's
not
terrible.
cool with this because I own too many. I own too many models. It doesn't matter anymore.
Well, now
Just like,
now at this point, you can literally play any kind of gameplay with any kind of faction. So I feel like
mhm.
people who are just playing the game for the game probably don't necessarily care as much
Yeah.
about like, yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Um,
Mm. So yeah, it seems like most games have some ability like to pull from some sort of outside of the miniature game world
mhm.
fluff. Like, do you know
Yeah,
fantasy? Do you know D&D? Do you know like the Star Wars or other like cyberpunk or that? They pull from that level, then you get into it, and then you like the gameplay, and then within that they can start creating their own stories. But they got to get you in
yeah.
the
There are
door, then get
stories
you in
from
the
Fluff.
minis, and then they can get
Yeah,
their own stories in there. So,
yeah.
anyways.
I think when I think about like the secret sauce, maybe it's just like just having a killer setting. Like
hmm
if you have a really killer 3 sentence description of like elevator pitch, right? Like three
Yeah.
sentence description of why the setting of your world or the of like the yeah of the game is cool.
hmm
That is enough. And then once like you said, right? You don't have to the detail is almost there just to make sure you can make those 3 sentences great.
Yeah.
Sometimes you
Well.
don't even have to. Like Blood Bowl, it's fantasy football.
hmm Well, I was thinking of Turnip 28 when I was thinking of games for this
Uh,
too. And it's just like vegetable virus takes over like Napoleonics. Do you like that
yep.
idea? You're in. Do you care about anything else? No.
No,
That'll get you
exactly.
in the
It's
door.
kind of weird. Yeah, even like one-page rules,
hmm
they don't make their own. Well, I guess apparently they're starting to make their own fluff. But
Hmm.
their entire business strategy is to be like where like we make rules that are pretty cool, and therefore all the fluff that you like from 40K, use that fluff.
hmm
That's our fluff.
Yep.
Just use our rules. Oh, and we
Or
also have models. We
we
also
have
have models
we
that you
now have
can
models
use.
later. Yeah. we're just like, we're more streamlined Warhammer of every form.
Yeah.
And people are like, oh,
Yeah.
more streamlined Warhammer.
And they
That's
literally
nice.
match up exactly, army to army, right?
Mhm.
They even have Primaris brothers, which is annoys me because obviously Primaris are not actually a different faction. I wonder if they're actually going to remove their like for one page rules. If the Primaris faction, Space Marines, are, because they have a normal brothers, battle brothers, and then they have Primaris brothers. I wonder now that they're becoming the same thing in 40k if they're going to fold those back in and just be one.
Oh, just like the Raiden disappears. They should. Like, there were no Firstborn. What are you talking about? They were never there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Well, I think that in the new Fluff, they're just saying they meld them together. And I was actually listening to Uncle Adam, the
YouTuber.
What do you call it? Yeah, the YouTuber, Tabletop Minions, and he was saying that he was describing how it was fine for Primaris because Primaris being big, right? Because they put it into the story. I was like, in my personal opinion, that was stupid. But apparently it's actually
matters
what
to
people need to make it work. Yeah, it matters. You're like, why is this guy so much bigger than this guy? Because your old model was a crappy model, and they're now making better models that are much more close to real, like true human scale.
Well, we came to the same
real
conclusion.
Reason.
Yeah, we came to the same conclusion for Infinity with them breaking off a whole bunch of miniatures out of one faction. I'm like, explain it with a story. Good enough. You're like, no, it was my faction.
Yes.
Story.
Yeah, we're just talking with one of the guys.
Story.
I don't know. I guess this is also going to get into media criticisms and what makes a good story. So I think we can leave that out because that's not necessarily directly important,
we don't.
Right?
We don't.
It just needs the story.
Yeah.
I have opinions. Let me put it that way.
Obviously, let's definitely not get into reality and story crafting in reality. That's too much.
I will say, like, if you knew my favorite movies, you would know that I have no business telling other people what good stories are. But anyways, yeah, okay. So when you look at so we talked about obviously like the strongest games that apparently can hook people forever have this like deep fluff, great setting. Right, great setting, deep fluff that hooks people in for a long time, and it helps you carry on. Right.
Yeah.
How about for these smaller games? Right, like we're creating a game. Our game is much smaller. It has a much reduced footprint. We have written like a bunch of we've written a timeline. Right, we have a bunch of stories. Each of the factions, we have an idea of who they are, and we have a setting for the world. We didn't used to, but we have like a setting for the actual gameplay to help hook things more, to dial it back into it, right? Into we have a once deserted world, right, where just underneath there's all these research facilities, and through a bunch of circumstances, all of these spec ops teams are ending up here trying to get this information very quickly, right? That's our setting. Still work in progress, but that's the kind of idea that we have, right? For these smaller independent games, right, as opposed to these things with giant IPs and things like that, do you think that having this kind of deeper story, like besides the three sentences, which we are obviously still working on to like craft it to make it sound good and interesting, do you think that the depth matters for smaller independent things? Like, I do know there's like, so what's the second game from Starling Badger was Space Station Zero, right? That has a much deeper kind of story and interesting kind of thing happening because it's also a campaign, right? It's actually a campaign game.
A campaign needs story. There's no way around that.
Yeah, and so, but there's also a game like Relic Blade, which has a pretty deep actual story, right? Like a lot of things happening. I don't think that's what really hooked me for that game, though.
No, I think from what we discussed, no one's getting hooked on the deeper stories. They're just staying for them.
Yeah, so it's really just the top level setting at the beginning that you got to get hooked. Then it's gameplay. Then to really hook you afterwards.
Yeah, and I think those indie games really need to latch on to like some existing idea in people's minds, just like we talked about, like all those other games. It's like,
it has to be very obvious when you see it, right? Yeah, I guess that's the other thing. The other thing that can win people over, even if you don't have something, even if you're not just like generic, movie kind of property or something, but now the game, right? If you have art and miniatures that can immediately sell the story and why it's cool, you can do it, I think, without having that, tropes.
Yeah, I think it can also work that the art and the story can merge two different ideas. You don't have to be something quite as generic. You can jam two different ideas together, just kind of like how Infinity is like, oh, it's like sci-fi plus anime. And then like Gaslands, more like
Gaslands is definitely generic.
Gaslands is very generic. Like Turnip 28 is Napoleonics plus like zombie virus. You're like, okay.
Not just any zombie virus, it's vegetable zombie virus. Yeah.
Or like Carnivale that I guess you picked up some of that. It's like, I guess that's also
Venice like Carnival
plus like Cthulhu, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like you can put two ideas like that together as an indie game. I think people
Cthulhu is the least important part though.
I don't know, but
it's crazy carnival, people fighting, yeah.
Yeah, but you're not just like, oh, it's just this. You can actually like make a bit of a deeper setting. I think you can put two ideas together in people's minds, and it actually gives it like a creative bend to it. So I think that can work too, as the top.
And level. I think when you're talking about, I think maybe the story is more there for like when you like. It also I think helps. When it hooks people, right? When you hook people, when they've started playing games, they see the story come out of the gameplay. They see the story from the miniatures, especially for games that have miniatureless lines or miniature lines with a game.
Yep.
Having the game and the story, like having them sell the miniatures and vice versa, is is almost like super impactful, right? So to me, like Carnivale, the story I don't think is nearly as important, or also I don't necessarily think the story overall is that good, but the setting is great, and the miniatures, the way that they look, kind of sell that setting, right?
Yeah, maybe if you'd already gotten into the game and there were some cool stories surrounding one of the factions, or at least stories you thought were cool, you might go and eventually buy into that faction because you're like, damn, these guys are super cool. I want to do something with them. So.
Yeah, I don't know. Right now, I just like the idea of just like the bourgeois and fighting, just the dock workers and them killing each other and guys with masks and stuff like that. And that's the thing that I think is like the cool part of the game, right? Kind of more like an Assassin's Creed-esque kind of fight going on.
Yeah. Yeah, so our game, I guess, kind of has like the Dune-ish setting, being on like a desert world / I guess slightly Star Wars-ish, like the Tatooine, like desert world where like a whole bunch of various peoples from all over are gathered on it. But I'm just wondering if like because it's more like it's a bit more technologically advanced sci-fi, or no, those are both pretty technologically advanced, but just whether there's another idea to it. Well, there's a zombie outbreak portion of it too, which is kind of like the Resident Evil, going into the lab of Resident Evil, and like there being all sorts of weapons and crazy shit. So there are like different ideas.
I think there's also the thing in the setting in our world, right? Like the science fiction is in some ways more advanced than Star Wars, but in some ways less advanced because it's not pulp science fiction, right? It's more like we take the cues more from cyberpunk in terms of the world, but it's not cyberpunk, right? But it's like it's a more modern kind of what would the future in terms of the factions actually be, right? So you have everyone is kind of a little bit of a post-human, right? Everyone is way more advanced than post-humans. Even like I guess these are all Spec Ops teams, so there's no just like normal guys walking around. But like the different forms, right, are all post-human in some sort of way, right? They're greater than so that greater than like a normal guy, whereas in Star Wars you have that idea of, just normal mooks running around and doing things, right? So and being like rising up to be great through, the whole Western kind of, and hero's journey kind of thing, right? So, and magic, space magic as well,
Yes.
which we do not have, right?
No.
So
I'm just trying to think what major intellectual property is all about, like people being like advanced humans.
the way when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, writing about, the, the factions and things like that. There's obviously like a Dune kind of esque idea of, there's an empire that's, kind of coming into civil war, right? Which is very, very popular. It's the Romans and things like that. And then you have all these other people, like these other other forces, like the enemies of the empire on the outside, infiltrating inside, waiting for, to see what happens to the empire with this civil war. But then the actual technology on the planet and all, like how they look and things like that, and what the technologies are, I think more. Have you ever, in terms of post-human-esque like things, have you ever read the comic Blame?
No.
Exclamation mark. It's supposed to be blam, but it's Japanese, so the translation made it blame exclamation mark instead of.
It's a better name.
The gun sound. Blame. No, it's not blame. It's blame exclamation mark. It's like, I blame you for having to use my gun. So so in the world, basically, you start off. It's one of those things where like you start off. When you watch a movie or something like that, or in this case, it's the comic book, right? You see these. The guy just looks like a normal human, but he basically ends up quickly doing things that no human could do, and then random other humans that just seem like normal humans, like fall and survive crazy kind of things, right? And you're like, oh, these look like humans, but they're obviously way more advanced, right?
So we're into cyberpunk edge runners where people are just like augmenting themselves, or is it?
Yeah, but it's like way past that, right? So cyberpunk edge runners is the question of, what
hardware do you install?
And there's the question of, are you losing your humanity if you advance, you become better? What are you losing when you augment yourself? Like, what are we actually doing? Are we rushing into this too quickly? What is the social dynamics of the fact that some people will be augmented and some people will be not, right? In our setting, it's like, 1,000 years after, assuming, there's no nuclear war, Earth was not wiped out, we spread around the stars, like developing your humanity into like superhumans, right? Like augmenting yourself is not a big deal. That's just, everyone is augmented, right? You're born, you have so in the world there's like a human phenotype, right? Where that is, the normal body that the empire says, this is the body you should have, so that, all of our services, right? Everything can interface with you. We can, medical treatment, we can diagnose you and all those kind of things, right? So there is some idea of having some limits on what you can, like who you are, right? But then the other factions in many ways are people who are outside of the empire who do not necessarily line up with that, right? So we have like the Ishtar, the Scalians, and the Furians, who have basically wholeheartedly embraced, doing random, like every child can be changed, right? Or augmented genetically, right? So even though they're biological, they change their bodies to be more like lizard people or furry people to survive in kind of whatever climate that they're in, right? And that has caused friction between, them and the empire, and that's why they had, a long history of war and things like that. You have obviously the mutants, and then you have the other faction, the technocrats, who are like basically cyborgs, because they were engineers and they're the guys who are like basically computer geeks. So the idea of just being like biologically augmented, right, means little to them, and they're like the most in terms of cybernetically, like having cybernetic bodies as opposed to everyone else. And then you have like the post-humans who are like this rich upper class who fled out into outer space, who had a lot of money and basically perfected their bodies and or have like the the most perfect kind of post-human like bodies that you would think about now when you think about, let's say, edge runners, right? Like cyberpunk, and they've kind of come back, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, what was the
Exactly. Yeah, like how do you explain that as like an overarching concept in
the
like
thing is, it
2
doesn't
words?
even really matter,
Mm-hmm.
right? It doesn't matter on the top level. When we talk about it, we're
It's
talking
basically
about the setting of the world, the fight, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
talking about a miniature game. You want people to play the miniature game. Like
All that
when you talk
matters
to
is the sci-fi combat, like on a devastated research planet.
yes, and then
That's
all
all
these
that
different
matters. It's
settings.
sci-fi. That's covers it. The deeper layers are for when people like get into it.
But yeah, so like once
Mm-hmm.
people start looking at the thing, then you want to look at, okay, so these are the different factions. What is the thing that interests you, right? That's when you kind of get hooked on these different things, different kind of settings, different fluff of these different factions, right?
Yeah.
Like when I look at
And just for people to have like this shared story when they're playing the game, it means they can create that versus it won't be like my impression of Stargrave of somebody being like, oh, it's my Space Marines and you're bringing your Jedi. It won't. Their story can at least mesh because that layer exists below the surface of just saying it's sci-fi on in this, and this is going on in this area.
And in some ways, it's even important at the beginning. Like, yes, it piques your interest. You're looking at it, but then when there's a lot of different steps in miniature games to actually getting it on the table.
Mm-hmm.
So
you got to build the table. You got to
you got to build a table. You have the right settings. You got to have the miniatures, right? So you need some sort of kind of fluff or interesting ideas, right? So for Stargrave, I know you hate. It's not actually Space Marines. It's Inquisitors versus Jedi, right? But the fact that they have in the story that you can be those Inquisitors or those Jedi, right, is the thing that makes people interested once they open the book and look in and say, oh, can I build a warband for me, right? Is this a thing that I find interesting that I will want to play more, right? And I think that kind of gives you the extra need and the extra sparks the imagination to get you to actually fully build that warband, right? Get beyond just it's interesting, I'll read the rules or buy the book or whatever, thing like that, right?
Yeah, because when you go into the game, like we talked about that high level thing, that I want to play like, let's say, pirates. You don't necessarily want to be, you don't know like which exact pirate faction you're going to play. Like maybe you are playing like the rich pirates. Maybe you are playing like the Imperial Spanish Navy. Like you don't necessarily know who you're going to want to play with in that to begin with. Same thing, like even if you say we're going to play like Warhammer, like, okay, you played 40K, you're going to go play Kill Team now you're going to play like Necromunda now. Maybe you're like, that's what you play in 40K doesn't influence what you're going to play in Necromunda. You're just like, that's the same world, but you're going to read through the factions and see what like sparks it beyond there.
Yeah, but each of the factions, right? Like initially there was not actually that much. There was just a couple words almost, right? And just a list, right, of each of the different factions.
And then some art. Yeah.
But here's the thing. I was going to say, but the art is really what sold all of those things and evoked so much, right? It wasn't the words. In fact, for a lot of 40K and Games Workshop stuff, they use art to do the talking, right?
Yeah, like the covers of the books for the codexes, they're in the store, the covers of the box sets, like.
But the art is also intentional, right? It's not just like random. Like in some ways, it was random stuff that's cool, right? But there was, the people that were creating it had the idea of worlds in their head, right? So as the art kind of builds up, you have crazy things, but all pulling around this theme, and that kind of makes things, sells the idea, right, to people. Like I think recently there was an interview with John Blanche, and he talked about the Black Templars art.
Yep.
Right, and that to a lot of people was seminal. The seminal Games Workshop Warhammer 40,000 art that really sells people like, oh, this is a cool world, right? Just that one piece of art evokes so much, right? You say a picture paints 1,000 words. That one is like, really good picture paints like 10,000 words kind of thing.
Yeah,
right?
I know. It's the art though that makes it like it's not the art to get you into the game. It's not the art that's inside of the books. It's the art that's like right on the face of the cover. It's on the product. It's on the web pages now. Like that's the art that I think gives the people the first impressions. Like obviously later when you start flipping through the books, it matters to get you more like into the game and the choosing factions. But
but the art for those specific factions, I think, is actually very important as well, right? Like every piece of art, like you could replace a lot of story blurbs if you just put a really beautiful piece of art that evokes a lot.
If you could,
right?
If you could afford to make all that, yeah.
Exactly, right?
But
that's what Games Workshop can do, right? Like Age of Sigmar, when it was released, honestly, the story was hot garbage. It wasn't even, there was like barely a story there, right? But what they did have was amazing artists churning out lots of really cool art, going through gates and fighting, right?
Yeah, they're pretty
even
sick
though
minis
the
too.
story was really kind of lame, honestly. It was a very much a World of Warcraft-esque, like gamified, like each instant servers where you fight on this one.
Oh my god. Yeah.
The art made it cool. It made me like, oh, maybe it is cool to like go into this instance of the world and fight in this realm gate, right? Like they've moved away from that so far now because they realized that story was lame. But the art carried the day, and Age of Sigmar sold so much better than the Old World, even though the Old World has so much fluff and story, right? And it's come back now because of like Warhammer Total War, right? But it was just the evocation of how things looked that really helped sell Age of Sigmar. And almost like, honestly, I find Age of Sigmar, the story is still there's actually a lot of cool stuff now, right? But not when it started off. And I feel like a lot of the story and everything is set up so that you can just make really cool art pieces of war.
Yeah, the game I see is just like literally an art piece on the board. Like,
yeah. Apparently the game is okay. I gotta tell you, I'm thinking of creating of actually creating that Goblins army that I started. We'll see if I actually ever do it. I have like, I'm not even done my orcs army. It is October, but I haven't even finished like the five orc pieces that like space orc pieces that I have just on my desk. It's just that it's actually not on my desk. It was staring at me. All of them were staring at me accusingly, so I just threw them into the box. The box, or they will never be seen again. But so so I think when it comes down to it, I think we've talked about definitely the setting, how important that is, and we've emphasized that, and the general fluff. But I do think when it comes down to it, it is it has to be. It's not just the fluff being the secret, this kind of the secret sauce, but it is more of how all of these things, like the art, the miniatures, the setting, kind of come together to kind of sell this idea and spark this imagination and this wonder and this kind of desire to live in this world, right? And the fluff and the story specifically slot in there to help build things up, but only almost like as a co-piece to the many other different things that are all like lining up and selling that kind of thing. And honestly, at this point, I think I would say after this conversation, my thought would be that actually it is like three sentence setting, right?
Yeah.
Being able to parse it in a way that can really sell people, that kind of is in some ways the most important, right? And obviously things go in cycles. So it's like the 3 sentences that kind of hook people when they're receptive to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they want it. And then you have all of these other things, the fluff, the art, the miniatures, and the gameplay that backs it up, that kind of helps sell all of those things to get people not only interested, but hooked in the long run to continue to play. And I think for a lot of those games, though, the fluff is integral part to that thing.
Yeah, I think that's what.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's what we've seen from the people we've talked to, and just like people's impressions they give to others on the net about games they like.
Yeah. So I think, as we've said many times, Warhammer 40,000 is particularly strong in the fluff. Do you think that they are almost like an outlier?
Yeah, I think so. But they put quite a bit of work into writing, like they've
Or
written
is it
codex
more
and they've
like,
refined it.
yeah,
They've just
or
been
is it
around.
more like there's a lot of different games? Like there's almost 2 sections of games, right? There's the IP games, which sell the games purely on the IP, and those are by far the strongest, like in terms of market share that can hook people. And then you have the games, the indie games, the space where we hang out, where the like little cool nerds who it's not enough to just say, hey, you know that thing you love? Here's some of it in miniature form. We're just like in the same way of movies where a lot of people, are just totally happy to watch more Star Wars and Marvel movies. Then you have like indie nerds who are like, oh no, that's more Marvel, more whatever DC. No, I need something new, something fresh. Send me here's the 5 different things from this small indie movie festival that I watched that you should actually watch for something fresh and unique.
Yeah, I need my ability to be a special snowflake, not just play the Marvel character that everybody knows. Yeah.
It's not just a special snowflake of the character. It's I want the entire experience to be special snowflake. Oh, you play that game? No, I play something totally different that doesn't play like anything you've ever touched before, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is kind of the indie space. And I feel like that's where I live at this point in our miniature gaming careers, right? We've walked away from all these things with like large
pre-built audiences,
IPs, all of this great fluff and story, and we move towards games that are boutique and different and showing us something that is more unique. And in that case, fluff is a lot smaller in terms of its importance with these kind of games. But again, it's probably because they don't have time to build it up, right? Like we said, for us, Grave, we played it so long. We get the fluff now, right? All this fluff has come through, right?
Well, yeah, he's just had more time to like build up the resource that exists as a game.
I think the same things have happened with Relic Blade, and I think Turnip 28, actually, the guy, I think he was creating another game with tanks in the same setting, which, I think the Turnip 28 guy is an artist, right? So it's the art that sells kind of the game and the kind of idea and that evocation, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's an interesting kind of dichotomy between those two things, and it really, I think, depends on who you're selling to in the end, how important it ends up being.
Yeah, I don't think you can control that. You just have to cater to your audience in that respect of those two different groups.
Yeah, there's no silver bullet, right? For some people, fluff is everything. For some people, whatever, just show me cool mechanics and make the dice rolling and the maths in the game interesting.
Yeah, honestly, like I'll only come back if the game is interesting. Like I'll jump into it for the reasons everybody else does because there's a cool level of setting at the top. But then, like I'll either bounce off the game or stay in the game because of the rules, and then story's the next layer.
Story's like the last layer for you. You feel?
Yeah, like? story's what keeps you in there because like, oh, this is evolving. There's more being delivered to me. I don't feel like this is over. Like people talk about games being living games or dead games, and unfortunately, to like some level, it matters that those stories are still like you're still expecting a story, so you still consider yourself a player of the game.
That's a good point. there's like a metatextual narrative of alive and dead games. That if you're playing a game like Necromunda, like a campaign game that's dead, or Mordheim that's technically, you know, being a dead game, the idea that in the game you're playing a campaign that's alive breathes life into it, even though the metatextual idea of the fact that it's not actually growing is not there. Whereas if you have a game that you're playing just for the game, you still care about life for the game. It just becomes almost the life and the setting of the game is almost like, you know,
because you can't change it. Yeah, because you can't change it because you're not in a campaign. The game is just, they have to move the game for the game to change. You can't move your characters.
Yes. And the story of the game has to come from, you know, the living, and in some ways the story becomes the life of the game, the new releases of the game, right? In an almost like sports or gamey kind of way, right? So
yeah, we might
stories are
that more later.
Even I know. In that one, before we open up that can of worms, I think that's about time to wrap it up. So yes, that's our idea on. Did we ever answer is Fluff the secret sauce? I think the answer is no. I think there's so much more, or it is for some people.
It's the extra spice. It's not not in the main
it's not
ingredient
the secret
list.
one. Yes, it's not. Yes, it is a spice, and for some people it's important, but again, it depends. All right. So if you have any thoughts on it, if you have or any questions about our thoughts on this kind of things, or any questions about our the game we've been working on, the Fluff there, you can email us at contact@diceovereverything.com.
Yeah, or find us on Facebook. We're Dice Over Everything.
This has been Alan.
It's been Brandon.
Bye.